order. And I'd like to welcome our witnesses today, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, Director of Central Intelligence Agency, John Brennan, Director of Defense Intelligence Agency, General Vincent Stewart, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Jim Comey, and Director of the National Security Agency, Admiral Rogers. To each of you, welcome. I'd note that Director Clapper and General Stewart have already appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee this morning, and I appreciate you both suffering through a very long day of testimony. I also thank our other witnesses for their attendance and participation. Today's hearing presents an opportunity for both the witnesses and members of the committee. It's my sincere hope that our discussion will shed some light on the dedicated and tireless work of our intelligence community professionals. The men and women represented by our witnesses. Their efforts to keep America safe often go unrecognized, but that does not mean it goes unnoticed. I've spent the better part of 20 years as a member of the Congressional Intelligence Committees and have seen the scale, scope, and type of threats to our nation evolve greatly. We no longer live in a world defined by a few distinct and well-defined threats. Our intelligence professionals are faced with collecting against and analyzing the threat posed by a range of actors from nation states on down to homegrown violent extremists. Director Clapper, in your statement, you've pulled together the collective expertise of the intelligence community's extraordinary men and women. We value your laying out for our benefit the diverse and evolving and decentralized system of threats that imperil this nation and its interest across the globe. And I ask that everyone take a moment to reflect on the range of expertise required to make sense of this information. I note in your statement that cyber, and more broadly, technology, headline your global threats. I agree with the assessment that innovation and increased reliance on information technology in the next few years will have significant consequences on society's way of life and, more specifically, how your officers perform their mission. I look forward to your highlighting some of the challenges and consequences as you see them. I also remain concerned by the technological reach of ISIL and the danger of their using the information technology, social media, and online research capabilities we use every day to propagate their barbaric message. Jim, I do hope you'll dedicate some time to laying out that particular threat, and I thank you again for being here today. I'd like to also highlight for my colleagues that the committee will be holding a classified hearing on worldwide threats later this week. To the degree it needs saying, please reserve any questions that you think might not be appropriate for an open session until the Thursday hearing. With that, again, I welcome our witnesses here today, and I turn to the Vice Chairman for any comments she might have.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. And I join you in welcoming our witnesses and also thanking the intelligence community for its service to this country. I also share your sentiment that this annual open hearing is important to help explain to the American people the threats that face this nation and the efforts of the dedicated men and women of the intelligence community to keep us safe. I want to open my comments by recognizing the significant contributions made by you, Director Clapper, as the leader of this community. You're the longest-serving Director of National Intelligence to date, and I think both the Chairman and I remember when the DNI was developed and put into effect. Your capable stewardship of the community has driven it to be a more integrated and capable organization than at any time in history. So I want to personally thank you for the contributions you have made to this country's security. But, as you know, there is no rest for the weary. The threats that face this nation and our allies seem only to grow. The Syrian war is approaching its 5th year, yet Bashar al-Assad is still in power, and a refugee crisis is destroying the lives of millions of innocent families and wreaking havoc across Europe. We are witnessing the resurgence of an unpredictable Russia in Eastern Europe and Syria. North Korea last month conducted its 4th nuclear bomb test, and 2 days ago conducted what it called a space launch. Of course, this is actually a thinly veiled test to develop missiles that could deliver weapons of mass destruction against a number of countries, including the United States. While these threats are significant and troubling, we are all deeply concerned about the threat from ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and other terrorist groups. To us, ISIL is much more than a regional threat within the Syrian and Iraqi borders. It's a terrorist army, a global exporter of terrorism, with a presence in a number of countries. The official count is 11, including ISIL affiliates. But some of our friends, like the King of Jordan, have said there are in as many as 17 countries. And ISIL has the ability to spread its message of hate and violence around the world using social media in a very sophisticated way. Director Clapper, I've read your written comments, and I'm very much interested in your assessment of these global threats, their status today, and the outlook for the future. I'd also ask you to comment on how the intelligence community is positioned to address these threats. Is it better today than it was, let's say, 5 years ago? For instance, while the coalition's air campaign is helping to deny ISIL some territorial safe havens and financial resources, how do we degrade it and destroy it if all they need to carry out an attack in the West is an internet connection and an encrypted message application? I'd like to hear your assessments of how the rise of end-to-end encryption has impacted our nation's ability to identify and track individuals who seek to do us harm. Director Comey has spoken of this concern often. Director Rogers recently highlighted it as well. I'm interested in your views today about its impact and how you recommend we tackle this problem of terrorists and criminals communicating via these encrypted message applications. The U.S. Freedom Act that passed last year eliminated the bulk collection of telephone communications metadata, and the new law now requires specific queries with FISA court approval to individual telecommunication companies. Has this change affected your ability to discover new threats and relationships? So I'll save the rest of my comments for questions, but gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. We look forward to the discussion.
Before I recognize Director Clapper, let me say to members, it's my intent, hopefully it's been conveyed to all members, you will be recognized for 5 minutes in the order that you appeared. And with one exception. If there is no objection, when Director Clapper's testimony is over, I would like to recognize Senator Lankford for first set of questions, for the simple reason that on Tuesdays he has to preside over the Senate, and he has to preside at 3:20 today, and I'd like to let him get a set of questions in. So, James, you will be recognized. With that, the floor is yours, Director Clapper.
Chairman Burr and Vice Chairman Feinstein, members of the committee. First, Chairman Burr, thanks very much for the acknowledgement, particularly of the great men and women of the U.S. intelligence community whom we represent here today. And it's very appropriate that you do that for the great work that they do. And Madam Vice Chairman, thank you very much for acknowledging my long service. It's very gracious of you. We're here today to update you on some, but certainly not all, of the pressing intelligence and national security issues facing our nation, many of which you both alluded to. And so there'll be a certain amount of echo here, I guess. In the interest of time and to get to your questions, we'll cover just some of the wave tops, and mine will be the only opening statements so we can go to your questions. And I apologize in advance to the crossover members who were present this morning at the Senate Armed Services Committee. But in the highest traditions of that's our story, we're sticking to it, it'll be the same statement. As I said last year, unpredictable instability has become the new normal, and this trend will continue for the foreseeable future. Violent extremists are operationally active in about 40 countries. 7 countries are experiencing a collapse of central government authority, and 14 others face regime threatening or violent instability, or both. Another 59 countries face a significant risk of instability through 2016. The record level of migrants, more than 1 million, arriving in Europe is likely to grow further this year. Migration and displacement will strain countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. There are some 60 million people worldwide considered displaced. Extreme weather, climate change, environmental degradation, rising demand for food and water, poor policy decisions, and inadequate infrastructure will magnify this instability. Infectious diseases and vulnerabilities in the global supply chain for medical countermeasures will continue to pose threats. For example, the Zika virus, first detected in the Western Hemisphere in 2014, has reached the U.S. and is projected to cause up to 4 million cases in this hemisphere. With that preface, I want to briefly comment on both technology and cyber specifically. Technological innovation during the next few years will have an even more significant impact on our way of life. This innovation is central to our economic prosperity, but it will bring new security vulnerabilities. The Internet of Things will connect tens of billions of new physical devices that could be exploited. Artificial intelligence will enable computers to make autonomous decisions about data and physical systems and potentially disrupt labor markets. Russia and China continue to have the most sophisticated cyber programs. China continues cyber espionage against the United States. Whether China's commitment of last September moderates its economic espionage remains to be seen. Iran and North Korea continue to conduct cyber espionage as they enhance their attack capabilities. Non-state actors also pose cyber threats. ISIL has used cyber to its great advantage, not only for recruitment and propaganda, but also to hack and release sensitive information about U.S. military personnel. As a non-state actor, ISIL displays unprecedented online proficiency. Cyber criminals remain the most pervasive cyber threat to the U.S. financial sector. They use cyber to conduct theft, extortion, and other criminal activities. Turning to terrorism, there are now more Sunni violent extremist groups, members, and safe havens than at any time in history. The rate of foreign fighters traveling to the conflict zones in Syria and Iraq in the past few years is without precedent. At least 38,200 foreign fighters, including at least 6,900 from Western countries, have traveled to Syria from at least 120 countries since the beginning of the conflict in 2012. As we saw in the November Paris attacks, returning foreign fighters with first-hand battlefield experience pose a dangerous operational threat. ISIL has demonstrated sophisticated attack tactics and tradecraft. ISIL, including its 8 established and several more emerging branches, has become the preeminent global terrorist threat. ISIL has attempted or conducted scores of attacks outside of Syria and Iraq in the last 15 months, and ISIL's estimated strength globally now exceeds that of al-Qaeda. ISIL's leaders are determined to strike the U.S. homeland, beyond inspiring homegrown violent extremist attacks. Although the U.S. is a harder target than Europe, ISIL external operations remain a critical factor in our threat assessment for 2016. Al-Qaeda's affiliates also have proven resilient. Despite counterterrorism pressure that's largely decimated the core leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Al-Qaeda affiliates are positioned to make gains in 2016. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the al-Nusra Front, the Al-Qaeda chapter in Syria, are the 2 most capable Al-Qaeda branches. The increased use by violent extremists of encrypted and secure internet and mobile-based technologies enables terrorist actors to go dark and serves to undercut intelligence and law enforcement efforts. Iran continues to be the foremost state sponsor of terrorism and exert its influence in regional crises in the Middle East through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, its terrorist partner Lebanese Hezbollah, and proxy groups. Iran and Hezbollah remain a continuing terrorist threat to U.S. interests and partners worldwide. We saw firsthand the threat posed to the United States by homegrown violent extremists in the July attack in Chattanooga and the attack in December in San Bernardino. In 2014, the FBI arrested 9 ISIL supporters, and in 2015, that number increased over 5-fold. Turning to weapons of mass destruction, North Korea continues to conduct test activities of concern to the United States. On Saturday evening, Pyongyang conducted a satellite launch and subsequently claimed that the satellite was successfully placed in orbit. Additionally, last month, North Korea carried out its 4th nuclear test, claiming it was a hydrogen bomb, but the yield was too low for it to have been a successful test of a thermonuclear device. Pyongyang continues to produce fissile material and develop a submarine-launched ballistic missile. It is also committed to developing a long-range nuclear-armed missile that's capable of posing a direct threat to the United States, although the system has not been flight tested. Despite its economic challenges, Russia continues its aggressive military modernization program. It has the largest and most capable foreign nuclear armed ballistic missile force. It has developed a cruise missile that violates the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty. China continues to modernize its nuclear missile force and is striving for a secure second strike capability. It continues to profess a no first use doctrine. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, provides us much greater transparency into Iran's fissile material production. It increases the time the Iranians would need to produce enough highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon from a few months to about a year. Iran probably views the JCPOA as a means to remove sanctions while preserving some nuclear capability. Iran's perception of how the JCPOA helps it achieve its overall strategic goals will dictate its level of adherence or compliance to the agreement over time. Chemical weapons continue to pose a threat in Syria and Iraq. Damascus has used chemicals against the opposition on multiple occasions since Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention. ISIL has also used toxic chemicals in Iraq and Syria, including the blister agent sulfur mustard. The first time an extremist group has produced and used a chemical warfare agent in an attack since Aum Shinrikyo used sarin in Japan in 1995. Turning to space and counter space, there are about 80 countries are now engaged in the space domain. Russia and China well understand how our military fights and how heavily we rely on space. They're each pursuing destructive and disruptive anti-satellite systems. China continues to make progress on its anti-satellite missile program. Moving to counterintelligence, the threat from foreign intelligence entities, both state and non-state, is persistent, complex, and evolving. Targeting a collection of U.S. political, military, economic, and technical information by foreign intelligence services continue unabated. Russia and China pose the greatest threat, followed by Iran and Cuba on a lesser scale. As well, the threat from insiders taking advantage of their access to collect and remove sensitive national security information will remain a persistent challenge for us. With respect to transnational organized crime, I do want to touch on one crime issue, specifically drug trafficking. Southwest border seizures of heroin in the United States have doubled since 2010. Over 10,000 people died of heroin overdoses in the United States in 2014, much of it laced with fentanyl, which is 30 to 50 times more potent than heroin. In that same year, more than 28,000 died from opioid overdoses. And cocaine production in Colombia, from which most U.S. supplies originate, has increased significantly. Now let me quickly move through a few regional issues. In East Asia, China's leaders are pursuing an active foreign policy while dealing with much slower economic growth. Chinese leaders have also embarked on the most ambitious military reforms in China's history. Regional tension will continue as China pursues construction at its outposts in the South China Sea. Russia has demonstrated its military capabilities to project itself as a global power, command respect from the West, maintain domestic support for the regime, and advance Russian interests globally. Moscow's objectives in the Ukraine will probably remain unchanged, including maintaining long-term influence over Kiev and frustrating its attempts to integrate into Western institutions. Putin is the first leader since Stalin to expand Russia's territory. Moscow's military venture into Syria marks its first use since its foray into Afghanistan of significant expeditionary combat power outside of the post-Soviet space. Its interventions demonstrate the improvements in Russian military capabilities and the Kremlin's confidence in using them. Moscow faces the reality, however, of economic recession driven in large part by falling oil prices as well as sanctions. Russia's nearly 4% GDP contraction last year will probably extend well into 2016. In the Mideast and South Asia, there are more cross-border military operations underway in the Mideast region than at any time since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. In Iraq, anti-ISIL forces in Iraq will probably make incremental gains through this spring, similar to those made in Baiji and Ramadi in the past few months. ISIL is now somewhat on the defensive, and its territory and manpower are shrinking, but it remains a formidable threat. In Syria, pro-regime forces have the initiative, having made some strategic gains near Aleppo and Latakia in the north, as well as in southern Syria. Manpower shortages, however, will continue to undermine the Syrian regime's ability to accomplish strategic battlefield objectives. The opposition has less equipment and firepower, and its groups lacks unity. They sometimes have competing battlefield interests and fight among themselves. In the meanwhile, some 250,000 people have been killed as this war has dragged on. The humanitarian situation in Syria continues to deteriorate. As of last month, there are approximately 4.4 million Syrian refugees and another 6.5 million internally displaced persons, which together represent about 1/2 of Syria's pre-conflict population. In Libya, despite the December agreement to form a new government and national accord, establishing authority and security across the country will be difficult at best, with hundreds of militia groups operating throughout the country. ISIL has established its most developed branch outside of Syria and Libya, outside of Syria and Iraq in Libya, and maintains a presence in Sirte, Benghazi, Tripoli, and other areas of the country. In Yemen, the conflict will probably remain stalemated through at least mid-2016. Meanwhile, AQAP and ISIL's affiliates in Yemen have exploited the conflict and the collapse of government authority to recruit and expand territorial control. The country's economic and humanitarian situation also continues to deteriorate. Iran deepened its involvement in the Syrian, Iraqi, and Yemeni conflicts in 2015. It also increased military cooperation with Russia, highlighted by its battlefield alliance in Syria in support of the regime. Iran's supreme leader continues to view the United States as a major threat. We assess his views will not change despite the implementation of the JCPOA deal, the exchange of detainees, and the release of the 10 U.S. sailors. In South Asia, Afghanistan is at serious risk of a political breakdown during 2016, occasioned by mounting political, economic, and security challenges. Waning political cohesion, increasingly assertive local power brokers, financial shortfalls, and sustained countrywide Taliban attacks are eroding stability. Needless to say, there are many more threats to U.S. interests worldwide that we can address, most of which are covered in our statement for the record, but I'll stop this litany of doom and open to your questions. Before I do that, I do want to answer one question that Madam Vice Chairman asked about the state of the community now versus 5 years ago. I would like to think that we are better as a community just from the simple proposition, the sum being greater than the parts, because we operate as an integrated enterprise. And others may have a comment on that, and none of them are unwilling to disagree with me, but that's my view. So I'll stop there and open your questions.
Director.